It's a dirty job, but someone's got to do it. For many years, that was Tony's favourite phrase. He repeated it in the pub almost nightly like it was a mantra, though sometimes it was difficult to tell whether he was trying to convince everyone else in the place or somehow managed to convince himself. I still remember well the day that Tony decided the someone who had to do the dirty job was going to be someone else. I'd never seen anyone so certain in their own convictions or so utterly terrified by what they thought might come next. Usually he would arrive at the pub around 5, straight from his shift, but luckily cleaned and showered before he sat down. Tony, you see, was a sewer engineer working for the water board. The majority of his days were spent, in his words, knee-deep in shit. He would be up long before most of the world was even thinking about being awake and armed with his trusty headlamp, would descend through one of the heavy manhole covers into a grubby, foul-smelling network of tunnels that run and stretch beneath our towns and cities. According to Tony, the things that would put most people off this job were only concerns for the first few weeks.
Honestly, the smell bothered me a little bit at first,
he'd say.
But after a while you get used to it and hardly even notice, especially if you're on some job that's quite difficult or fiddly. Honestly, my favourite thing about the job is how quickly the time flies. When you're down there on your own, with nobody around and in the semi-dark, you can just focus and get totally lost in what you're doing. Before you know it, it's clocking off time and you can pack up for the day.
The other bonus for Tony for doing a dirty job that other people didn't want to do was that his company paid him well to do it. On payday every month, Tony would be the most popular man in the pub because he insisted on buying a round for all the regulars, reciting his other mantra, which was,
"When I'm flush, I'm flush. It's only polite to share the wealth."
Of course, in a lot of towns, news of a regular freebie like that would spread quickly, and soon enough you'd have a queue of people who had never even met Tony lining up at the bar and expecting to take advantage. In Morton, though, where most pubs had regulars and everyone knew everyone, that was never the case. In fact, it was the opposite. When payday rolled around one month and Tony hadn't shown up to the pub by 8 p.m, the locals weren't worried about missing a free pint. They were worried about Tony. He was there every day, regular as clockwork, especially on payday, so for him to be late or missing entirely was worrying. By the time the clock hit 9 p.m, people were making phone calls trying to get hold of him and his workmates to check he was okay. As it turned out, he wasn't. Around 9:15, a lad called Adam rolled into the pub looking like he'd seen a ghost. Adam worked with Tony, and no sooner had he stepped through the door than he was seeing a great number of folks who were very much alive asking after their favourite barfly and inquiring as to why he wasn't there. Adam shook his head.
"Something weird going on with him, I'm telling you. He turned up this morning, right as rain, and went down in the sewer, right here in Morton, somewhere near the town hall. I was up at the surface, he was down below doing what he was doing, and everything was fine. He was merrily working away like usual, everything going on as normal, and then all of a sudden he came back up. He bobs his head out, like a big mole, and pulls himself up and out. I was going to ask what was going on because he usually doesn't come up early, but he just pulled his gloves and helmet off, threw them on the floor and said, 'I'm done.'"
"What do you mean, done?" someone asked from across the room.
"Done. Finished. He said he'd had enough and that was the last time he was ever going down there."
I watched as the faces in the bar changed, a half-muttered murmur of disbelief travelling across the room like a ripple or wave.
"He said if I wanted, he'd help me look for jobs. When I said I wasn't the one quitting, he just shook his head. Trust me, lad, it's time to stop now. It's not so bad yet, but soon enough, sure as eggs are eggs. I'm not going back down there and you shouldn't be going either."
Nobody asked why. They exchanged glances that silently asked the question, and I'm sure that everyone was thinking it, but nobody verbalized it. Instead, they waited for Adam to explain. As it happened, he didn't have to, because at that precise moment, Tony came through the door. The reaction to Tony's arrival was strange. Usually, there was an eruption of welcome or at least some signal of acknowledgement. That night, the acknowledgement came as silence. Tony felt it too. He walked into the room as if he were wading into it, cutting and tugging against the unnatural quiet and the thickness of the atmosphere.
"Whiskey, please, lad,"
he announced in my direction. A noticeable change from his normal request of the usual, which consisted of a pint of Guinness and a packet of pork scratchings. At first, it seemed like Tony was simply going to take his seat, but instead, he turned to face the bar.
"I'm guessing young Adams told you all that I jacked it in today?"
Nobody responded, but the silence spoke volumes. Tony nodded. He took his usual seat at the bar and, looking into the mirrored wall behind the rows of bottles, began to speak, ostensibly to me, but in fact to the entire bar.
"I'm not going down there again, and I'll tell you why. When I was a little kid, my dad told me about Komodo dragons."
"You've never seen a bloody Komodo dragon down there? Alligators in the sewer. Come off it, Tone," someone shouted. A few people laughed, but it was a forced, strangulated sound, made by people desperate to lighten the mood and break the tension. Tony didn't laugh.
"I never said I did. I said my dad told me about them. The thing is, he told me why they're so big. According to him, it was because they lived on islands, away from everyone else and isolated. He said that when they're away, they can evolve quicker. Basically what happened was that the dragons used to eat each other, which basically meant the bigger ones would eat the smaller ones. After a while, that meant that the bigger you were, the more likely you were to survive. So those genes, the genes of the bigger ones got passed on and the smaller ones didn't, but the eating didn't stop. So what you got was bigger and bigger lizards, with the biggest ones still feeding on the slightly smaller ones, and every time the bigger ones survived, the bigger ones' genes got passed on. Bigger and bigger until one day, one of the slightly less big ones figured out how to climb a tree to escape. Nowadays, if you go there, you see all the youngsters up in the trees and the bigger ones on the ground. They evolved in a different way, but the size is still there. That's why they're so massive."
Tony took a swig of his drink as the other patrons looked at each other, trying to figure out what that had to do with the sewers under Morton, or with Tony quitting his job. Those who weren't wondering about that were wondering whether Tony had completely lost his marbles.
Thing is, that process, the big guns eating the little ones and getting bigger and bigger, it doesn't just happen there, it can happen in other places too.
At this point, a voice, the same one I thought had interrupted Tony earlier, called from the other side of the bar, forcing the words through a humorless laugh. "Come on, Tone, what are you going on about? I mean..."
"Listen,"
said Tony, cutting the other voice dead.
"Think of it like this. Imagine you're alone, in the dark, in a narrow little tunnel under the ground. Imagine that all you have to cut through the dark is the beam of your head torch, and that only goes in straight lines. So even when you light the place, there are dark bits all around and all above, as black as a lump of coal. Now imagine you're working, and all you can hear down there is a steady, constant drip, and the way it echoes down miles and miles of tunnels. It's lonely, and it's dark, and it's still, until you hear a squeaking. Not the normal squeaks you hear now and again, rats and mice scurrying away, but horrible, a big high-pitched squeal, like something in pain. So you look around, you look to check that something isn't trapped down there, a dog or cat that's got stuck in a drain, and you look up and you see...
He trailed off and took another long draught from his drink, holding up the empty glass in a motion for me to refill it.
You see a rat trying to get out through a grid. Its top half is stuck between the metal bars, trying to force its way out, and underneath its bag legs are kicking and fighting and struggling because they're being chewed, they're being cut and sliced and mangled by a cockroach the size of a house brick. It's stuck on the rat, stripping it and feeding on it, and it isn't the only one. You turn and shine your head torch, and you see them, dozens of them, all along the ceiling of the tunnel. Some are the size of bricks, others the size of cinder blocks, bread bins, and one or two the size of a small cat. They're hanging up there, scurrying and rusting over each other, moving away from the light and into the dark space in front and around you, and somehow you know that if they get too close, they'll start to feed on you, so you run. You wade back up the tunnel, back toward the manhole, and as you do, you're looking down and seeing them. Carcasses of animals, the bones sticking up from out of the filth. You didn't notice them on the way in, but now you do. Tens, dozens, scores of them. Rib cages, thigh bones, tiny skulls of rats and birds, and one or two that look like dogs. You remember as you get to the ladder your neighbour whose Yorkshire Terrier suddenly disappeared, or old Mr. Lane's cat that vanished a couple of weeks back. You pull yourself up as fast as you can and you can hear them behind you, skittering and scurrying, an awful rusting sound like dry leaves rubbing over one another as they get closer and closer, chasing the light and the scent of you. You pull up and out into the street, and you fling off your gloves and your helmet, and you know you're done.
Nobody spoke.
There were big ones and small ones. If the big ones are eating the others, then they'll keep getting bigger, the size of a cat, the size of a dog. I'm not going to be there to see one the size of a fridge, because that thing won't just be eating rats. I put in a request to the council. I want a full sluice this week and another the following day. Tons and tons of water through the tunnels, pump it through, flush it out, and send all that crap as far away as possible. I hope they take the advice.
The council did take the advice, not because of the creepy crawlies, but because Tony had worked in those sewers for 20 years, and if he said it needed sluicing, then they were going to listen. Tony stopped coming to the pub after that. From what I hear, he retired a few years later and moved to Spain. What still worries me to this day, though, is that now there's a new crew of lads, youngsters, who've never heard the horror stories told to us by Tony. At the moment they work in the city and in the surrounding areas, but soon enough they'll end up going into the sewers that still stretch under Morton. I tried a few weeks ago to tell them about Tony. They listened politely, but in the end they only laughed. "It's a dirty job," they said, "but someone's got to do it."